Imagine setting up a simple bird feeder in your yard, just a small way to bring some life and color to your morning coffee routine. But then your HOA Karen neighbor shows up, clipboard in hand, declaring that it's a violation because it attracts too much wildlife. She demanded I take it down, file complaints, even threatened fines. So I did exactly what she asked. But instead of just having one little bird feeder, I turned my entire yard into an officially certified bird sanctuary, complete with legal protections that Karen couldn't touch, even if she tried. Oh, and did I mention? Now there are birds everywhere, singing, chirping, and flying right past her window. All day long. Before we dive into this feathery masterpiece of HOA revenge, don't forget to like, subscribe to Tailflow, and comment below if you've ever dealt with a petty neighbor like Karen. It all started with a simple bird feeder. Nothing fancy, just a small wooden feeder I hung from a tree in my front yard, filled with sunflower seeds and a bit of suet. I've always liked birds. There's something peaceful about watching them flit around in the morning while sipping coffee. And honestly, it made my yard feel alive. The neighborhood seemed to enjoy it too. My neighbor, Mr. Thompson, would often smile and nod when he passed by on his morning walks. Even the kids down the street would pause to point out cardinals, finches, and the occasional blue jay. But, of course, there was one person who didn't appreciate the charm. Enter Karen. Karen was the self-appointed HOA enforcer, though she preferred to call herself the Neighborhood Standards Coordinator, which is just a fancy title for fun police. She lived 2 houses down, always lurking from behind her perfectly trimmed hedges, watching like a hawk, or maybe more like a vulture. One morning, I was refilling the feeder when I heard that unmistakable, sharp voice behind me. "Excuse me." I turned to see Karen, arms crossed, clipboard in hand, wearing a scowl like it was part of her outfit. "Yes," I replied, already sensing where this was going. "That bird feeder," she said, pointing like it was radioactive. "It's attracting too much wildlife. We've had reports of disturbances." Disturbances? I glanced at the feeder. A chickadee was happily munching away, clearly part of an underground bird gang causing mayhem. I raised an eyebrow. I'm pretty sure the worst thing that's happened is a squirrel stealing a snack. Karen's scowl deepened. "It's a violation of HOA guidelines. You'll need to remove it immediately." I'd read the HOA handbook. There was nothing in there about bird feeders. But Karen loved to invent rules as she went. So I smiled. "I'll look into it," which is polite speak for "I'm not doing that." 2 days later, I found an official-looking letter taped to my door. Notice of violation. Your property has been reported for attracting an excessive amount of wildlife, posing potential hazards to the community. Immediate removal of all bird feeders is required to avoid fines. I laughed out loud. Excessive wildlife? We're not talking about a raccoon invasion. I had a couple of sparrows and maybe an overly ambitious squirrel. But Karen wasn't done. She doubled down, slipping passive-aggressive notes into my mailbox. "Your yard is becoming an environmental hazard. Consider the impact on property values." And my favorite, "Some neighbors find it disruptive." Translation, Karen finds it disruptive. At this point, I had 2 options. Take down the bird feeder and let Karen win. Or do something spectacularly petty. Guess which one I picked? That night, while sipping my coffee and watching a determined squirrel attempt acrobatics for a peanut, inspiration struck. If Karen hated one bird feeder, what would she do if my yard became an entire bird sanctuary? Not just a casual setup, but a legally protected sanctuary that she couldn't touch, no matter how many complaint forms she filled out. I did some research. Turns out, you can apply for certified wildlife habitat status through national programs if you meet certain criteria. Provide food sources, fresh water, shelter, places to raise young. I already had the food covered. Water, easy bird baths, shelter. A few birdhouses and some dense shrubs would do the trick. And here's the best part. Once it's certified, HOA rules can't override environmental protections. I had found my loophole. The next weekend, I got to work. Karen was outside, of course, tending to her perfectly bland garden, watching me like I was committing a crime. I started small, added a few more bird feeders, installed a large bird bath right in the middle of my lawn, planted native flowers to attract hummingbirds and butterflies. But I didn't stop there. I built birdhouses, colorful ones, strategically placed where Karen could see them from her front window. She couldn't resist. By the third day, she stomped over. "This is excessive," she snapped, gesturing wildly at my yard. "You're creating a nuisance." I smiled. "Actually, I'm creating a wildlife-friendly habitat." She sputtered. "You can't just turn your yard into a zoo." I shrugged. "Funny you mention that. I'm actually applying for certification as a wildlife habitat. Should be official soon." Her face? Priceless. A few weeks later, after submitting my application with photos of happy birds and thriving plants, I received the official certification. I wasted no time. I mounted the shiny new sign right in my yard. Certified Wildlife Habitat, providing food, water, shelter, and a place to raise young. Karen saw it the next morning. She stood frozen on the sidewalk, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She couldn't do anything. The birds? They kept coming. Dozens of them. Chirping, singing, flapping their little wings all day long. And every time Karen heard them, she was reminded that she'd lost. After the bird sanctuary sign went up, I thought maybe, just maybe, Karen would finally accept defeat. But I underestimated one thing: Karen's dedication to pettiness. She wasn't going to let this go. Not when there were HOA meetings to hijack and complaint forms to fill out. So, of course, her next move was to take the battle to the HOA board, convinced she could still win. A few weeks after my yard became a bustling bird paradise, I received an email from the HOA. Subject: Notice of scheduled HOA meeting regarding wildlife concern. Wildlife concerns? Gee, I wonder who brought that up. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at the community center. Karen had officially filed a formal complaint against me, claiming my bird sanctuary was nuisance to the community, an environmental hazard, and my personal favorite, an uncontrolled wildlife infestation. She wasn't just annoyed anymore. She was on a mission. But here's the thing. I was ready. I gathered my documents. A copy of my wildlife habitat certification, state and federal guidelines that showed my sanctuary was 100% legal, and just for fun, photos of happy birds living their best lives. The community center was packed, way more people than usual for an HOA meeting. Apparently, word had spread that Karen was about to declare war on birds. Karen sat at the front, clutching her clipboard like it was her sword. The HOA president, Mr. Daniels, looked like he regretted his life choices. The meeting began. Karen stood up, her voice dripping with indignation. "This bird situation has gotten out of control," she declared, waving around photos of my yard. "It's attracting dangerous wildlife, causing noise pollution, and it's a violation of our community's aesthetic standards." She sounded like I'd open a zoo for crocodiles, not put up a few bird feeders. When she finished, the room was silent for a beat. Then Mr. Daniels turned to me. "Would you like to respond?" I stood up, calm and collected. "With all due respect, my yard is a certified wildlife habitat. I've complied with all legal requirements, and there's nothing in the HOA bylaws that prohibits bird feeders or native gardens." I handed over copies of my certification, highlighted the relevant HOA rules, and even read a section about encouraging environmentally friendly landscaping. Karen's face started to twitch. She wasn't used to people being prepared. After reviewing the documents, Mr. Daniels sighed. "Well, based on the information provided, there's no violation here. The certification is legitimate, and we can't override state or federal environmental protections." Karen's jaw dropped. She shot out of her seat. "So we're just going to allow this? This bird circus?" The room chuckled. Not with her at her. Mr. Daniels gave her a polite but firm smile. "Yes, Karen, we're going to allow the birds. Round 2 victory." But Karen wasn't done. As people filed out of the meeting, she stood near the door, ranting to anyone who'd listen. "It's ruining property values. There are feathers everywhere. What if a bird attacks someone?" Most people just nodded politely and kept walking. Some rolled their eyes. One guy whispered, "I'd rather have birds than deal with Karen." I walked past her, smiled, and said, "Have a nice day, Karen." She glared at me like I'd kicked her cat. But there was nothing she could do. After the HOA meeting, something unexpected happened. More people started putting up bird feeders. It was like the whole neighborhood realized. Birds aren't the problem. Karen is. Mr. Thompson added a new feeder in his yard. The family across the street put up a bird bath. Even the Johnsons, who rarely spoke to anyone, planted flowers to attract hummingbirds. Karen had accidentally created a community-wide bird movement. And every time she stepped outside, she was greeted by the sounds of chirping, fluttering wings, and neighbors enjoying their newfound bird-friendly freedom. After the HOA meeting, I thought Karen might finally give up. But Karen isn't the type to accept defeat, especially when it's served with a side of public humiliation. She'd lost the HOA battle. She'd lost the neighborhood support. But in true Karen fashion, she wasn't ready to surrender. So she went nuclear. A few weeks after the HOA meeting, I received an official-looking letter from the city's code enforcement office. Subject: Notice of Property Inspection. Complaint regarding uncontrolled wildlife habitat. Uncontrolled wildlife habitat? Gee, I wonder who filed that complaint. Anonymously, of course. The letter claimed my yard might be violating local ordinances related to property safety and pest control. They scheduled an inspection for the following week. I couldn't help but laugh. Karen really thought she could out-petty me with paperwork. Challenge accepted. When the city inspector arrived, I greeted him with a smile. Let me guess, you're here about the bird feeder situation? He chuckled. Yeah, we got a complaint. It sounded a little dramatic, but we have to follow up. I gave him the grand tour. My certified wildlife habitat sign proudly displayed. Bird feeders strategically placed. Bird baths clean and well-maintained. Native plants thriving, attracting butterflies and bees. The inspector took notes, snapped a few photos, and nodded. Well, everything looks good. This isn't a pest issue. It's just a healthy yard. In fact, he paused, glancing at my certification. You've done a great job. This is exactly what we encourage in urban environments. I grinned. So, no violations. Not even close. Now here's the best part. Karen had been watching the entire inspection from her window. And the moment the inspector left, without issuing any citations, she stormed over. Excuse me, she barked. I need to speak with you. The poor inspector looked confused. Ma'am, can I help you? I filed a complaint about this property, she snapped, pointing at my yard like it was a crime scene. There are birds everywhere. It's disruptive. It's unsanitary. The inspector blinked. Ma'am, it's just birds. Karen's face turned bright red. But there are too many of them. At this point, Mr. Thompson from next door had wandered over, sipping his coffee. He chuckled. Karen, I think the birds live here now. You'll have to move. The inspector stifled a laugh, thanked me for my time, and left. Karen? She stood there for a second, then spun around and stomped home, muttering under her breath. After that, Karen's reputation was pretty much cemented. She wasn't the neighborhood enforcer anymore. She was the lady who lost a battle to birds. People started getting creative. Birds welcome signs popped up in yards. Neighbors put little plastic flamingos on their lawns, just to be extra petty. Someone even gave me a gift, a doormat that said, Home Tweet Home. Karen? She kept her curtains closed more often. Probably because every time she looked outside, she saw a neighborhood full of bird feeders, bird bath, and happy neighbors. Months passed, and Karen eventually stopped complaining altogether. Not because she'd had a change of heart, but because she realized the more she fought, the more ridiculous she looked. She started minding her own business. And for the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt peaceful. Except, of course, for the constant sound of birds chirping, which, to me, sounded like victory. Karen's final attempt to shut down my bird sanctuary had officially backfired. After her meltdown at the city inspection, it was clear she wasn't just defeated, she was done. But while Karen faded into the background, something unexpected happened. The neighborhood came alive. What started as a petty feud over a bird feeder turned into something bigger. A movement, a rebellion. A neighborhood that finally realized we didn't have to live under Karen's rule. Before all this, our street had been like any other HOA-controlled community. Perfectly trimmed lawns, Beige houses with the same approved paint colors. The occasional neighborly wave, but not much more. After Karen's defeat, it was like someone flipped a switch. Neighbors started adding their own bird feeders, then bird baths, then gardens full of native plants attracting butterflies, bees, and yes, more birds. It wasn't just about birds anymore. It was about people realizing they could actually enjoy their homes without worrying about some petty HOA enforcer breathing down their necks. Even Mr. Thompson, the quiet retiree next door, added a giant birdhouse shaped like a miniature Victorian mansion. When I complimented it, he grinned and said, "How to keep up with the neighborhood standard. You know, the new one." As for Karen, she never formally apologized. She never admitted she was wrong. But she stopped complaining. No more passive-aggressive notes. No more HOA violation letters mysteriously showing up on doors. No more surprise inspections. She'd lost her grip, and she knew it. She became just another neighbor. One who kept her blinds closed a little more often and walked her dog with her eyes glued to the ground, avoiding the friendly waves she used to ignore anyway. It was the perfect defeat. No dramatic showdown. No final argument. Just silence. And a neighborhood full of chirping birds to remind her exactly what she lost. Of course, I couldn't resist one last, small victory. A few months after everything settled down, I hosted a little neighborhood barbecue. Nothing fancy, just burgers, hot dogs, and a bunch of people enjoying the community Karen had accidentally helped build. As a joke, someone brought me a gift. A tiny wooden sign, painted bright yellow, with bold black letters that read, "Dedicated to Karen, the woman who made this possible." I placed it right next to my bird feeder. Not out of spite, just as a friendly reminder. And every time Karen walked past, I'd see her glance at it. She'd roll her eyes. She'd mutter under her breath. But she never said a word. Because what could she say? She made it possible. Looking back, this whole thing taught me a few valuable lessons. Petty problems deserve petty solutions. Sometimes the best way to deal with people like Karen isn't to argue. It's to out-petty them with style. Know the rules better than the people trying to enforce them. Karen relied on intimidation. But once I realized she didn't have real power, her threats lost all their weight. Community is stronger than control. When people come together, even for something as small as bird feeders, it creates connections that no HOA rule can break. Revenge is best served with birdseed, and maybe a little plaque dedicated to the person who accidentally helped you win. Years later, my yard is still a certified wildlife habitat. The birds still visit every morning. The neighborhood is still colorful, lively, and best of all, free from Karen's tyranny. And every time I hear a bird chirp outside my window, I can't help but smile. Because to me, it sounds like victory. And that's how a simple bird feeder turned into the ultimate symbol of HOA rebellion, and how one petty neighbor accidentally brought an entire community together. Have you ever dealt with a neighbor like Karen? Or maybe you've had your own battle with an HOA that went a little too far. Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video to support more HOA takedown tales. Subscribe to Taleflow for epic revenge stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next petty showdown. Thanks for watching, and remember, when life gives you a Karen, just add birdseed. See you in the next one.